market square at Wrenhaven smelled of hay and warm bread and horse sweat, and the sun sat high over the stone chimneys like a lazy coin. It was market day, the busiest day of the month, and the little village near the Duke's estate was full of noise. Wooden wheels rolled over cobblestones. A woman shouted the price of eggs. A boy near the well laughed too loud and got scolded by his mother. Somewhere behind the bakery, a fiddler played a slow tune that no one really listened to, but everyone somehow felt. The air was heavy with the smell of apples and old cheese and the faint smoke of a smith's fire 2 streets over. Miss Vivienne Ashcombe walked through it all with a small basket on her arm and a list she did not need to look at. She was 24 years old, unmarried by choice more than by lack of chances, and she wore a plain gray dress that had once been blue before 3 too many washings. Her hair was pinned up simply because she had no time for anything fancy, and a strand had already come loose to tickle the back of her neck. She had a way of walking that did not draw eyes. She moved through the market like water moves through stones, going around instead of through, noticed only by those who bothered to look twice. Very few people bothered to look twice at Vivienne. That was fine with her. That was, in fact, exactly how she preferred it. She stopped at the cheese cart and let the old man cut her a small wedge. He wrapped it in cloth without a word, and she paid him without a word, and they nodded at each other the way people nod when they have done the same small thing every week for 4 years. Behind her, the noise of the square rose and fell like the tide. She could hear the rattle of a butter churn, the bleat of a goat tied to a post, and the low, steady murmur of voices that had come from 10 villages to buy and sell and gossip. Above all of that, she heard something else. A boy laughing. Not the boy at the well. A smaller laugh, higher, closer. She turned her head without meaning to. He was maybe 4 years old. Perhaps 5, with brown curls that fell into his eyes and a small blue coat that had been mended more than once at the elbow. He was sitting on the low stone wall by the horse trough, kicking his heels, holding a piece of ginger cake in one dirty hand. His mother stood a few steps away, haggling with a woman over a bolt of ribbon, and she kept looking back at him every 3 seconds the way mothers do. He was safe, he was watched, he was happy. Vivienne did not know his name. She only smiled, small and quick, and turned back to the cheese man to say thank you. That was when she heard it. It began as a sound the mind cannot quite name, a low rumble under the feet like distant thunder, but wrong, because the sky was clear. The cheeseman's hand paused above the counter. The old woman at the ribbon stall lifted her head. The fiddler stopped in the middle of a note. For half a heartbeat, the whole market square went still, the way a forest goes still before a great wind. Then the shouting started. It came from the top of the hill road, the road that led up to the pasture lands of the Duke of Ashbourne. A boy came running down first, a lanky farm boy of maybe 16, arms waving, mouth open in a wide black shape of terror. Behind him, the sound grew. Hooves, not one horse. Not 10, many, too many. And under the hooves another sound, a deep bellow that turned Vivienne's stomach cold. Cattle. She had heard of it. Every farming village had heard of it, a herd being moved from one field to another, spooked by a snake or a stray dog or a whip snapped too near an ear and turning as one great body into a thing without mind. A stampede. It had happened to a neighboring village 3 summers past. 6 people had been trampled, 2 had died. The boy from the hill screamed one word. Run. For a moment the market square did nothing. Bodies froze, baskets tipped, a goose flapped free of its cage and went honking up onto a rooftop. Then the panic came all at once, the way water comes through a broken dam. People shrieked, people threw down whatever they were holding. Mothers grabbed children. Old men stumbled. A cart of pears turned over, and pears went rolling everywhere like little suns. Vivienne heard all of it and none of it. Her eyes had gone to the boy on the wall. His mother was not beside him anymore. The mother had been pushed by the crowd, spun by the running bodies, and was now 3 yards away, screaming his name, reaching, being carried the wrong direction by the tide of people. The boy did not understand. He was still holding his ginger cake. He looked up at all the shouting adults with a small, confused frown, the way a child looks up when he has just woken from a nap and cannot remember where he is. The ground was shaking now. Vivienne could feel it in her teeth. She could hear the rumble growing into a roar, the pounding, the deep bellowing of the beasts, and under it a sharper sound, the crack of a horse's hooves on stone that meant the herd had reached the top of the market street. In her mind, without wanting to, she saw the market square as if from above. She saw the narrow lane the herd would come down. She saw the wall where the boy sat. She saw the exact line the beasts would take. He was going to be trampled. In less than the time it takes to say a prayer, she did not think. Thought is slow. Thought is a candle in a hallway. What she felt instead was clear and sharp as a bell struck once, and it was this: he must not be there when they come. Her basket fell. She heard it hit the stones, and she did not care. Her feet were already moving. She ran, not gracefully, not the way a lady is supposed to run, but with her skirts bunched in one fist and her other arm out ahead of her as if she were reaching for the very air. People shoved past her the other way, running from the sound, and she pushed against them, an ant crawling upstream against a river of ants. Her shoulder hit a man's chest. Someone's elbow caught her ribs and she gasped, but did not stop. The boy on the wall was 3 yards away. Then 2. Then 1. She reached him just as the first cow came round the corner. It was enormous. Black and white, wide of horn, its eyes rolled back so far the whites showed all around. It was not running from something. It was simply running, the way a stone falls, without will, without stop. Behind it came another and another, a mass of hides and horns and hooves, a wall of moving flesh that filled the whole width of the lane. Vivienne did not look at them. She looked at the boy. He looked at her with the confused wide eyes of a child who has just realized the world is not safe. She scooped him up in both arms. He was heavier than she expected and warm through his little coat, and he smelled of milk and dust and ginger. She turned her back to the herd. There was no time to reach the doorway of the baker's shop, no time to reach the alley, no time. So she did the only thing she could do. She fell forward with him, into the small space between the horse trough and the wall, and she curled her body around his body like a shell curls around the small soft thing inside it. She pressed his face into the hollow of her throat so he would not see. She held the back of his head with one hand. She braced her other arm against the stone. She closed her eyes. The world turned into noise. It was the kind of noise that does not have parts, that is only one thing, an enormous solid wall of sound that pressed on her ears and her chest and the inside of her skull. The ground did not shake. The ground boomed. A hoof caught the edge of the trough beside her head, and the trough shifted an inch and cold water sloshed onto her hair and her cheek. Something struck her back, hard. A glancing blow that felt like being punched by a horse, which of course was exactly what it was. She heard herself make a small sound, not a scream, just a sharp breath in. Another blow, this time to her hip. The boy trembled against her, but did not cry out. She could feel his little heart beating fast as a bird's against her collarbone. She whispered to him. She did not know what she said. Later, she would not remember. Something like, "Shh, I have you, I have you, I have you." Her mouth was pressed to his curly hair, and she could taste dust and salt and the metal tang of her own fear on her tongue. It went on and on. It could not have been more than a minute, perhaps less. It felt like the length of a whole life. Above her the beasts thundered past, and around her the sound of them was the sound of the end of the world, and she held on. She held on. She held on. Then it was over. The last hoofbeats faded down the far end of the square. The bellowing grew distant, then more distant, then almost gone. In its place came a strange, thin silence. The silence that comes after a bell has stopped ringing, but the ear still remembers the sound. Vivienne did not move at first. She was afraid to. She thought if she moved, she might discover she was broken, or that the boy was broken, or that she had only imagined surviving. She stayed curled around him, her face pressed to his hair, and she listened. She heard the boy breathing. Fast, shallow, but breathing. That was enough. That was everything. Slowly, carefully, she uncurled. Her back screamed at her. Her hip felt like someone had taken a hammer to it. Her hair was wet down one side, and she could not tell if it was water from the trough or blood, though she suspected some of both. But her arms worked. Her legs, when she tested them, worked too. And the boy was whole. She lifted him a little away from her chest and looked at him, and his eyes were huge, and his lower lip trembled, and there was ginger cake smeared across his cheek where he had held it against her shoulder the whole time. "You are safe," she said. Her voice came out hoarse. "You are safe." "Do you hear me?" He nodded once, a tiny nod, and then he began to cry, silently, in the way small children cry when they have been too frightened to make noise. She pulled him back into her and held him and rocked him a little, sitting there in the dust and the spilled water and the mud that the herd had left behind. Only then, slowly, did she realize that the square was full of people again. They had come back. They had crawled out of doorways and from under carts. They had come from the alleys and the shops, and now they stood in a wide, ragged ring around the horse trough. They were staring at her. All of them. No one spoke. It was the second silence of the day, and it was somehow louder than the first. The boy's mother broke through the ring first. She fell to her knees on the stones so hard, the sound of it made Vivienne wince. She did not thank Vivienne. She did not say a word. She simply took the boy from Vivienne's arms with hands that shook so violently they could barely close, and she pressed her forehead to his forehead and made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a sob. Just something a mother makes when she has been given her whole world back after believing it lost. Vivienne watched them. Then, gently, feeling every bruise now that she had time to feel them, she began to rise. That was when she saw him. He stood at the edge of the ring of people. He was tall enough that even in the crowd her eye went to him first. He wore a dark green riding coat and dust-colored breeches and boots that had known real work, and his hair was black and disordered as if he had been riding hard. He was not classically handsome. His face was too severe for that, too much bone in the jaw, too heavy in the brow. But he took up the space around him the way a large stone takes up the space in a stream. Everything else in the market square seemed to bend a little around him. She had never seen him before, and yet she knew who he was. Some things you simply know. The people nearest him had stepped back an inch without being asked. A boy holding a horse behind him touched his cap without looking up. A gentleman she vaguely recognized from a distant Sunday sermon was bowing, small and stiff. The Duke of Ashbourne. Her mind supplied the words even though her mouth was too dry to say them. He was looking at her, not at the mother and child, though he glanced at them once. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a thing he does not quite understand and is trying, right now, to understand. Vivienne looked back only because she was too tired to look away. Her hair was falling around her face. Her cheeks stung. Her hands were scraped raw from the stones. She could feel a slow, warm trickle down her temple that was, she now confirmed, blood. She must have looked like something dragged out of a ditch. She did not care. She met his eyes because there was nothing else her body would do. He took one step toward her, and then another. His boots rang on the stones. The sound seemed very loud in the quiet square. He stopped an arm's length from her. Up close, his eyes were an odd color, gray with something warmer running through them, like wood smoke against a sunset. He smelled of leather and horse and cold wind, and beneath that, faintly, of something clean, perhaps soap, perhaps only rain. "Madam," he said. His voice was low, careful, the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed but was speaking as if he were afraid he might break something delicate. "Are you injured?" Vivienne opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She tried again. "Not badly, Your Grace," she said. Her voice did not sound like her voice. It sounded like a voice she had borrowed from someone braver. He looked at the blood on her temple. He looked at her hands, one of which was still shaking a little at her side. Something in his jaw shifted. "Sit down," he said. It was not a request. But it was not cruel either. It was the way one speaks to a person one is afraid will fall. She did not sit, she could not. If she sat, she thought she might not stand again for hours. "I am well," she said. "There is a woman over there who fainted, and a child at the corner cart whose arm was struck. Please see to them first." He looked at her for a long moment. She could not read his face. But he turned his head, only slightly, and said one clipped word to the boy behind him with the horse, and the boy vanished at once, at a run. Then the Duke turned back to her and did not look at anyone else again. "They will be attended to," he said. "You are trembling." "I am cold," she said, though she was not particularly. It seemed easier than the truth. He removed his coat without ceremony. He did not ask. He simply took it off and settled it around her shoulders, and it was heavy and warm and smelled of him and of the horse he had ridden, and she felt her knees go. Just a little. Only for a heartbeat, and his hand came up under her elbow to steady her without any fuss at all. "I have you," he said quietly. Then, that was the bravest thing I have ever seen a person do. Vivienne did not know what to say to that. She had never received such a compliment in her life from anyone, and she was not sure she was equipped to receive one now, when her whole body hurt and she smelled of trough water and cow. She looked down at her shoes, which were ruined, and said, "It did not feel brave. It felt like the only thing to do." "That," said the Duke, "is precisely what brave people always say." He guided her to the edge of the low stone wall, not the wall she had scooped the boy from, a different one, a clean one, and she sat, and the crowd, which had been slowly beginning to breathe and move again, drifted around them like water finding its way past a stone in a stream. She could feel eyes still on her. She had never had this many eyes on her in her whole life. She was too tired to mind. Someone brought a cup of water. The Duke took it and gave it to her himself, holding it while she drank. His hand was steady. Hers was not. She would remember, later, the specific coolness of the tin cup and the faint taste of iron in the water and the way one of his knuckles had a small white scar on it. Very old. The boy's mother came over then. She had put the boy down for one moment, and she came and knelt in front of Vivienne and took Vivienne's raw, scraped hand in both of hers and pressed it to her forehead. She still could not speak. Vivienne closed her fingers weakly around the woman's fingers and said, "He is all right. That is what matters." The mother nodded and nodded again and rose and went back to her son. The Duke stood beside Vivienne without speaking. He did not fuss. He did not fill the silence with soothing sounds. He simply stood there, one hand loose at his side, the other resting on the pommel of a short crop tucked into his belt, and he waited. She found she was grateful. After a while he said, "What is your name?" "Vivienne Ashcombe," she said. "My father was the vicar at Little Pemberton, 2 miles from here." "I know Little Pemberton," he said. I did not know its vicar had a daughter. He did, she said. He does. He is retired now. He lives with me in the small cottage past the mill. I see. There was a long, quiet moment. She thought perhaps he would leave now. Great men had estates to run and duties to see to, and stampedes to explain to their stewards. She would not have blamed him. She half wanted him to go, because his presence made her feel too seen, and being seen after so many years of being overlooked was strange and hot on the back of her neck. He did not leave. Instead, he said, in a lower voice, the herd was mine. I owe you an apology beyond what any apology can carry. Your Grace, she said, startled into looking up. Surely it was not your mine, he repeated. My cattle, my drover, my responsibility. A young hand snapped a whip too near a bull's ear, and the bull broke, and the rest followed. It should never have happened. It will not happen again. She did not know what to say. She said, weakly, I am glad it was no worse. It could not, said the Duke, very quietly, have been worse than what almost was. He was looking at the horse trough as he said it, at the small space between the trough and the wall, at the dark shape of the mud there, where she had crouched with a child pressed to her heart. The bell of Wrenhaven's little church began to toll then, slow and small, as if not sure whether it was ringing for a disaster or for a mercy. The wind picked up and moved through the square and brought the smell of trampled hay and broken apples, and, faintly, the metallic smell of blood from somewhere. Vivienne pulled the Duke's coat closer around her shoulders, and its weight and warmth were the only things that felt real. I shall have my carriage take you home, he said. You are not walking 2 miles, not tonight, and not next week either, if I have anything to say about it. My physician will attend you at the cottage. I will pay for whatever repairs are needed to your father's roof, whatever medicines are required, whatever your household lacks. It is not charity. It is a debt. Your Grace, you cannot refuse a debt, Miss Ashcombe. That is what makes it a debt. She looked at him then, really looked at him. His face was not soft. It was the face of a man who had spent years making decisions no one else wanted to make. But there was a small tightness around his eyes that she recognized, having seen it once in her own father's face after a bad winter. It was the look of a man who was carrying something heavy and had just been reminded he was allowed to feel the weight of it. Very well, she said. Thank you. He almost smiled. Not quite. But something moved in his mouth that was close. That was how it began. She did not think of it as beginning, of course. In her mind it was ending, a terrible market day, a bruised body, a child returned to his mother, a great man being courteous because greatness demanded it. She was carried home in the Duke's carriage that afternoon, and she slept for a full day in her narrow bed with her father sitting by her side reading his old sermons aloud in a low voice. The physician came and pronounced no bones broken, only 2 cracked ribs, a great many bruises, and a shallow cut at the temple that would heal without a scar if she kept it clean. He left a small brown bottle of something that tasted foul and made her sleep dreamlessly. 2 days passed. 3. On the 4th day, a basket arrived at the cottage door. Her father brought it in with wide eyes. It was a very fine basket, woven of pale reed, and inside were things a country vicar's cottage almost never saw. A small glass jar of honey, dark as amber. A wedge of good cheese wrapped in muslin. A packet of tea, real tea, the kind that smelled of far places when you opened it. 2 loaves of white bread still warm. A small parcel wrapped in blue silk that turned out to hold a book, a slim volume of Cowper's poems, well bound but not new. On top of everything sat a folded note in a hand she did not recognize, small and controlled. Miss Ashcombe, it said. Do not thank me for this basket. It is not a gift. It is an insult, and I am aware of it. A basket cannot pay a debt of the sort you are owed. But my physician says you are not to leave your bed for another week, and I could not bear the thought of your household being at any inconvenience during that time. If you require anything further, you have only to ask." Ashbourne Vivienne read it twice. Then she folded it very carefully and put it inside the book of poems and set the book on the small table by her bed. Her father, when he read the note, sat down heavily in his chair. "Vivienne," he said, "do you know what you have done?" "I saved a child," she said. "That is all I did." "You saved a child," her father repeated, "and now the Duke of Ashbourne knows the name of my cottage." He said it not as a warning, precisely, but not as a joy either. Vicars, especially poor ones, know that when the great notice you, it can go a number of ways, and only some of them are good. Word spread through the village, of course. It could not spread. By the end of that week, everyone in 3 parishes knew the story of the vicar's daughter who had put her body between a small child and 100 head of running cattle. In some versions of the story, she had been trampled and risen from the dust like a saint. In others, she had faced down the lead bull with only her look. Vivienne, hearing these accounts through her father, only sighed and shook her head. "I hid behind a horse trough," she said. "There is nothing holy about a horse trough. There is when God spares what is behind it," her father said mildly. He said nothing about the Duke. At the end of the 2nd week, Vivienne was well enough to walk to the little garden behind the cottage and sit under the crab apple tree in the afternoon sun. Her ribs still ached if she laughed. Her hips still turned green and yellow like a slow bruise on a peach. But her hands were healed, and her head no longer swam when she stood, and she could once again do the small things she loved, pruning the herbs, mending her father's shirts, reading in the tiny yellow light of the parlor lamp. She was doing exactly this, reading Cowper, in fact, from the very book he had sent when the sound of hooves came up the cottage lane. She did not think anything of it. Hooves came up the lane sometimes. It was probably the miller's boy, or the woman from the neighboring farm bringing a jug of milk. She did not look up until her father, in the kitchen, said quietly, "Vivienne, he is here." She lifted her head. Through the small parlor window, she could see the shape of a large gray horse tied to the gatepost and a tall figure in a dark coat coming up the garden path. Her heart did a small foolish thing in her chest that she immediately scolded it for. She stood, smoothed her plain dress, tucked back the loose piece of hair, and went to the door. She opened it herself because they had no servant to do it, and there was no shame in that, though she felt his eye register it briefly before he stepped inside, without seeming to notice at all. "Miss Ashcombe," said the Duke of Ashbourne, and he bowed, and she curtsied, and her father came from the kitchen wiping flour from his hands because he had been trying to bake bread himself now that Vivienne was resting. They spoke of small things first. The weather. The state of the road. Her father asked politely after the herd, and the Duke answered gravely that the drover in question had been dismissed and the cattle sold because he had no wish to keep beasts that had made such a memory in the village. Vivienne watched him as he spoke. He was not making conversation the way great men make conversation with small people. He was speaking and listening as if her father's opinion actually mattered to him. Her father, a country vicar with darned cuffs and a soft laugh, did not seem to know quite what to make of this. He handled it, in the end, by simply being himself, and the Duke, to Vivienne's surprise, responded in kind. After a while, the Duke turned to her. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "I hoped, if you were well enough, to walk in your garden with you for a short while." She looked at her father. Her father, after a small hesitation, gave the smallest of nods. She fetched a shawl. It was not the Duke's coat. She had returned that, cleaned and pressed as well as she could manage, in a parcel sent to the estate 2 days after the market day, with a note that said only, "Thank you." V.A. He had not commented on its return. He had not needed to. They walked out through the herb garden and past the little rose that had been her mother's and down the narrow path that led along the stream at the bottom of the property. The afternoon was mild. Bees moved among the last of the lavender. A blackbird spoke from somewhere in the hawthorn. "You are recovering," he said. It was a statement, not a question, and she realized after a moment that of course he would know. His physician had been to see her 3 times. "I am," she said. "I am well, truly good," he said. Then, after a pause, "Miss Ashcombe, I have come to say something that will sound strange, and I would ask you to hear it out before answering. Is that fair?" "That is fair." He did not stop walking. He kept his eyes forward, on the path, as if he found it easier to speak while moving. "In the weeks since the market day," he said, "I have thought a great deal about what I saw. I am a man who has spent most of my life watching people show their worst selves when they believe no one important is looking. I have seen women faint on purpose. I have seen men beat their horses when they thought I could not see. I have seen mothers pinch their own daughters before a ball to make the daughters cry prettily. I could give you 100 such stories." Vivienne said nothing. Her hand tightened a little on the ends of her shawl. "I have not," he said, "seen many people show their best selves without knowing anyone was watching. And I have never seen anyone do what you did." "Your Grace, please, let me finish." She closed her mouth. "I have thought a great deal about how to speak to you about this," he said. "I have thought about coming to your father with a proper offer, in the proper form, as is done. I have thought about the season, and about arranging invitations, and about all the polite ways in which such things are usually set in motion. And in the end, Miss Ashcombe, I have set all of that aside. Because I do not believe I can do you the disrespect of pretending this is like other things." He stopped walking. He turned to her. She had to stop too. The blackbird, above them, went on singing. "I will not," he said, "make you an offer today. It would be too soon and would put you in a position you did not ask to be in. But I will say plainly, so that you understand what I am asking, that I would like your permission to court you. Openly, in whatever manner is comfortable to you. I do not ask for an answer today. I only ask that you tell me whether such a request is offensive to you, so that I may know whether to leave you in peace." Vivienne looked at him. His hair, in the afternoon light, had bits of copper in it that she had not seen before. His mouth was very still. He was, she realized with something like astonishment, afraid, not much and well hidden. But there, at the corner of his eye, he was afraid she would say yes out of gratitude, and he was afraid she would say no because of who he was, and he had not decided which he was more afraid of. She thought of a great many things she might say. She had a sharp tongue when she chose to use it. She had a habit of asking small, precise questions that made people look at their own words twice. She could, if she wished, ask him what a duke wanted with a vicar's daughter, and whether he had considered how his mother would receive her, and whether he had thought about the fact that she had no fortune, no connections, no beauty of the fashionable kind. Instead, she said, "It is not offensive to me." "Ah," he said, very quietly. His shoulders dropped, only an inch, and she understood he had been holding them. "But it does not," she said, "mean yes. I know. It means I will not object to seeing you again, on such terms as my father approves. I make no promises beyond that. That is all I asked." They walked back to the cottage slowly. He did not offer her his arm. She did not want him to. They spoke, on the way, of the book of poems he had sent, and she told him she had read it twice through, and he asked which poem she thought least of, because he said one could always tell a person's mind more from what they disliked than from what they admired. She thought for a moment and named the one about the deer, and told him why, and he laughed once, a low, real laugh, and said, "You are precisely right. I have always found that poem unbearably smug." She had not known dukes were allowed to laugh at Cowper. At the gate, before he mounted, he turned to her and said, "May I call again next week?" "You may." He bowed. He rode away. The gray horse's hooves faded down the lane and were gone. Her father was waiting in the parlor. He said nothing when she came in. He only looked at her over the tops of his spectacles. "I have said he may come again," she said, feeling the need to defend herself to no one in particular. "I heard," said her father, mildly. "Papa, Vivienne," he said, and there was a very small smile at the corner of his mouth. "I have known that man's family, from a distance, for 30 years. His father was a hard, cold man who taught his son a great deal about duty and almost nothing about kindness. If that boy has grown into a man who rides 2 miles to ask a vicar's daughter's permission to call again, then I think he is a better man than his father was. I would like to see him again, too." Vivienne sat down slowly. She said, into her hands, "Papa, he is a duke." "I know. I am a vicar's daughter. I know. It will not, that is, such things do not, Vivienne." Her father took off his spectacles and folded them and set them on the table. "There is a story in the village. Perhaps you have not heard it, because it has been told mostly in low voices. 3 winters ago, when Mrs. Halloran's boy fell sick with the fever. Do you remember?" "I remember. He almost died, and then a physician came from London and stayed a week, and the boy lived." "Yes, the physician was said to have been sent by a friend of the family." "He was not," said her father. "Mrs. Halloran had no such friends. The physician was sent by the Duke of Ashbourne and paid for by him, quietly, on the request of no one at all except an old servant of his who had once known the Halloran family. The Duke made her promise not to say. He told her it was not her place to tell, and it was certainly not his. Mrs. Halloran only told me because she said she could not go to her grave without one person besides herself knowing what he had done." Vivienne was very still. "I did not tell you before," said her father, "because it was not my story to tell, and I did not think you would ever have cause to know it. But I think perhaps today you have cause." She said after a while, "Why did he not tell anyone?" "Because," said her father, "some men do good in order to be seen, and some men do good because they cannot bear not to. It is not always easy to tell them apart from the outside. But it is always easy to tell them apart in the end." Vivienne looked out the small window of the parlor. The lane was empty. The gray horse was long gone. But she thought she could still see, faintly, the dust hanging in the still afternoon air where its hooves had been. The Duke came the next week. He came the week after that. He came then, every week for many weeks, always in the afternoon, always on horseback, always alone. He did not send flowers, though he brought books. He did not press his arm on her, though he offered it in wet weather. He talked to her father as much as to her. He listened when she spoke, and did not seem to require her to be brilliant or witty or lovely. He seemed, in some odd way she did not entirely understand, to be resting when he was with her. As though the world made small demands somewhere else, and here in the vicar's cottage with the crab-apple tree, he was permitted to simply be a man who liked tea and disliked bad poems. The village noticed. The village would notice a leaf falling in a strange direction. Some people were pleased. Some people were furious. Some people, in the way of villages everywhere, were both at once. Vivienne kept her head down and did her work, and, when she saw him, was herself, because she had no other self to be. It might have gone on like that for a full year, and been beautiful and simple and slow, if the world had allowed it. The world did not. The world sent Lady Ophelia Marchbanks. Lady Ophelia was the Duke's cousin on his mother's side, older than him by 4 years, unmarried by circumstance rather than choice, and considered a great beauty of the season 5 years past. She had reasons to be unhappy about many things, and she had reasons, chief among them a long-cherished belief that she would one day be the Duchess of Ashbourne, to be very unhappy about the news that had reached her from the country. She came down from London on the pretext of visiting her aunt. She stayed at the estate. She contrived within 3 days to be invited along on a country picnic that had been arranged for a small party of neighbors, at which Miss Vivienne Ashcombe and her father would also be present. It was to be held in the meadow above the river on a Wednesday afternoon in September, with cold chicken and cider and blankets on the grass. Vivienne wore her best dress, which was still a plain one, sprigged muslin that had been her mother's and altered twice. She had washed her hair with rosemary water. Her father wore his good coat and his one silk waistcoat and his happiest face. The Duke, when he saw her, did not smile largely, but something eased in the corners of his eyes in a way she had come to recognize. Lady Ophelia noticed all of it. Lady Ophelia noticed everything. She waited. She was patient. She waited until the food had been eaten and the cider poured, and a small silence had settled among the party, when the servants were setting out little cakes on a low table, and the sun was slanting golden through the birches. She waited until she was sure to be heard. Then she said, in a bright, carrying voice, "Miss Ashcombe, I have been dying to meet you all afternoon. I have heard the most extraordinary stories. Tell me, is it true you tackled a cow with your bare hands in the middle of Wrenhaven?" There was a small ripple of uncertain laughter. Some of the guests knew the story, some did not. Vivienne felt her father shift beside her. "I did not tackle any cow, my lady," said Vivienne calmly. "I only sheltered a child." "Sheltered," said Lady Ophelia. "How modest. And with your body, they say." "Yes, yes, extraordinary. I do wonder." And here she smiled. A bright, polished smile that did not touch her eyes, whether that was truly courage or only, forgive me, an excellent understanding of how one might be noticed. The words landed in the meadow like a stone dropped into still water. Vivienne felt them. She felt the small circle of guests go very quiet. She felt her father, beside her, stiffen. She felt, without looking, the Duke's stillness across the blanket, the way one feels a storm holding its breath before a very great crack of thunder. She did not look at him. She looked at Lady Ophelia. She thought, in a small far corner of her mind, that she had never in her life so exactly wanted to slap another human being. She did not slap her. She smiled, small and even, and said in a voice as calm as she could make it, "That is an interesting thought, Lady Ophelia. If I had wished to be noticed, I do think I would have chosen a better dress." Someone laughed, briefly, sharply. Someone else coughed. Lady Ophelia's smile did not slip, but a small color came into her cheek that had not been there before. "You must forgive me," said Lady Ophelia sweetly. "It is only that I am so very fond of Ashbourne, you see, and he has been imposed upon by the most extraordinary people in the past. I would hate to see it happen again." The meadow was silent. Vivienne set down her cider. Her hands, she noticed with some pride, were steady. She rose. Her father rose with her. Without a word, she turned to the hostess of the party, an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Pilkington, and curtsied. "Thank you, Mrs. Pilkington, for a most generous afternoon. My father has been unwell, and I think we should not stay longer. Your kindness in inviting us has been much appreciated." Mrs. Pilkington opened her mouth and closed it again. Vivienne took her father's arm. They walked, without haste, without hurry, without looking back, across the meadow toward the road. Behind them, no one spoke. They had gone 20 paces, perhaps 30, when Vivienne heard boots in the grass behind her. She did not turn. She did not need to. She knew the sound of that step by now the way she knew the sound of her father's cough or the creak of her own gait. The Duke fell into step beside them. He did not say anything at first. He simply walked with them across the meadow, past the low stone wall, out onto the dusty road that led back to the village. Only when they were out of sight of the picnic party did he stop. He stopped in the middle of the road, and Vivienne and her father stopped with him. "Miss Ashcombe," said the Duke. His voice was quiet. It was, she realized, a dangerous kind of quiet. "I must ask your pardon. You have nothing to ask my pardon for, Your Grace. It was not you who spoke. She is my cousin. She was under my roof. It happened at a table where I was seated. It is mine to answer for." "It was hers," said Vivienne. "And I have answered her, in my own way." He looked at her then, and something in his face shifted that she could not name. "You did," he said. "You did indeed." They walked her home, all three of them, in a strange, slow procession along the dusty road with the crickets beginning to sing in the hedgerow. At the gate the Duke bowed deeply over her hand and said, "I will call tomorrow, if I may." "You may," she said. He rode away. Her father waited until they were inside. Then he sat down heavily in his chair and said, "I have not in 50 years of preaching heard anyone put down so completely in so few words." "Papa, not you, my dear," he said, wiping his eyes, though whether from tears or laughter she could not tell. "Not you. Her." Vivienne sat down at the little table and put her face in her hands, and at last allowed herself to shake. That night, in the great house of Ashbourne, several things happened that Vivienne did not see and would not know about until much later. The Duke went home. He did not go to the drawing room, where Lady Ophelia and the other guests were taking sherry. He went to his study, and he sat for a long time at the great desk that had been his father's, and he thought. He was a man who solved problems. He had identified a problem. It was not the problem Lady Ophelia thought it was. At length he rang for his steward. He gave 3 instructions in a quiet voice. First, Lady Ophelia was to be informed, politely, but at once, that her visit to Ashbourne had come to its natural end, and that a carriage would be at the door for her at 8 the next morning to take her to the coaching inn at Chester. Second, a letter was to be sent to Lady Ashbourne, his mother, at her house in Bath, requesting the honor of her presence at Ashbourne within the fortnight for a matter he wished to discuss in person. Third, the steward was to draw up quietly a settlement of £100 a year in perpetuity upon the Reverend Ashcombe of Little Pemberton in respect of his long service to the parish, said pension to begin at once and to be paid from the Duke's private funds without any mention of the Duke's name. The steward, a stout, dependable man who had served 2 dukes and expected to serve a third, bowed and asked no questions. The next day the Duke rode to the cottage as promised. Lady Ophelia was, by that time, halfway to Chester in a very cold silence. The Duke sat in the little parlor and drank the tea Vivienne had made him and spoke with her father of parish matters for a full half-hour, as though nothing at all had happened the day before. Then he asked, as he always did, if he might walk with Vivienne, and Vivienne fetched her shawl. They walked down to the stream again. The blackbird was there again. He seemed to belong to the place. "I have been thinking, Miss Ashcombe," said the Duke, "about yesterday. Please do not think of it again, Your Grace. It is done. It is not done." He stopped by the stream. He looked at the water for a long time before he spoke. When he spoke, his voice was very level and very careful. "When I saw you in the market," he said, "on the day of the herd, I had already been watching you for perhaps 10 minutes. I did not know it was you. I only knew that in the middle of a very loud, very busy square, one person was moving, as if the world were only what it appeared to be, without performance. You bought your cheese. You said thank you to a man who no one else was saying thank you to. You smiled at a boy on a wall who was not your boy. You did not know I was there. You were not doing any of it for me. You were not doing it for anyone." He turned to her. "When the herd came, I saw only one figure move against the tide of running people. I did not know it was you then, Either I did not know your name until an hour later, when I had already made up my mind about a great many things. I do not tell you this to flatter you, Miss Ashcombe. I tell you this because I owe it to you to say plainly why I am here. It is not gratitude. It is not pity. It is not the impulse of a moment. It is that I have all my life been looking without knowing I was looking, and in one afternoon in a dusty village square I saw. He paused. Vivienne stood very still. The stream ran on. And, he said, more quietly, when my cousin said what she said in the meadow, I understood something else. I understood that if I did not act, quickly and clearly, the world would go on saying such things to you as long as I was undecided, and that would be a cruelty I would not permit. He reached then into the inside pocket of his coat. He brought out a small folded paper. He held it, without opening it, in his hand. I have a license, Miss Ashcombe, he said. It is a common license, obtained yesterday from the bishop, and it says that Julian Astor, Duke of Ashbourne, may marry Miss Vivienne Ashcombe of Little Pemberton at any church in this county for the next 3 months, provided both parties are willing. I have not yet spoken to your father. I would not, until I had spoken to you. I am not asking you to answer today. I am telling you that I have taken this step so that when you answer, you will know that my part is already done. Vivienne looked at the paper. She looked at his hand holding it. She looked at his face. She said, softly, You are very sure, Your Grace. I am, he said. For the first time in my life about a matter of this kind, I am. The world seemed to slow around them then. Later she would remember it as the third slow moment of a day that had already had 2. The wind moved through the leaves above their heads, and each leaf turned as if in its own small time. A bee moved between 2 flowers with the deliberateness of a great decision. The stream, which had been babbling, seemed to make each drop of sound separately, one at a time, like the ticking of a small clock. She could smell the sun-warmed grass and the faint honey of the last clover, and underneath the leather and cold wind smell of him, which she had come to know as well as any smell she knew. She thought about the boy on the wall. She thought about her father, and about the small note she had put inside the book of poems. She thought about the Halloran boy, whom she had never met, breathing in his mother's arms on the night a stranger had paid for him to live. She thought about a woman with polished eyes in a meadow saying an ugly thing in a bright voice, and how she had walked away from that woman across the grass with her father's arm in hers. She thought about herself, 5 years ago, at the age of 19, standing by the wall at a village dance and waiting for someone to see her, and how no one had. She said, I will need a little time, Your Grace. Not because I am unsure, because I would like to be able to look back at this moment one day and know I did not answer it in a hurry. The Duke inclined his head. That is precisely, he said, the answer of the woman I hoped you were. He put the paper back into his coat. He did not press her. He did not ask again. They walked back to the cottage. He drank another cup of tea with her father and spoke of the church roof, which needed mending, and said, quite casually, that he would send a man to look at it in the morning. Her father, who had heard from his old friend the parish clerk that very morning about a certain unexpected pension that had arrived on his behalf with no name attached, said only, That is very kind of you, Your Grace. He and the Duke did not look at each other for a moment. Then they both looked at their tea. That evening, after the Duke had ridden away, Vivienne walked down to the stream by herself. The bees were gone. The blackbird was gone. Only the sound of the water was left. She sat on a stone. She looked at her hands, still faintly marked from the market day. She thought about the shape of a small child pressed against her collarbone, and the warmth of him, and the beat of his small heart, and the way she had held on when there had been no reason to believe holding on would be enough. She thought, and she was surprised to find herself thinking it, that perhaps she had been wrong for a long time about what it meant to be seen. She had thought being seen meant being watched, and being watched meant being judged, and being judged meant being found wanting, and she had learned to be very small and very quiet and very careful, so that she would not be watched, and so would not be judged, and so would not be found wanting. But there was another kind of being seen. It was the kind where someone had watched you doing your small quiet thing in a busy square, and had thought there. That one. She is real. That one. She sat by the stream until the sky began to turn. She walked back to the cottage. Her father was reading in the parlor. He looked up at her over his spectacles. "Papa," she said, "when the Duke comes tomorrow, will you sit with us both in the parlor?" "Not because I need protecting. Because I have an answer to give him, and I would like you to hear it." Her father set down his book. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, small and true, the way he had smiled at her mother once, 40 years ago, in a small church in a smaller village. "Yes, my dear," he said. "I will sit with you." The Duke came the next afternoon. He was, she thought, very slightly paler than usual, and he took his tea with a hand that was almost not quite steady. He drank it anyway. Her father sat in the third chair, hands folded in his lap. She said, when she was ready, "Your Grace, I have thought about what you said to me by the stream." "Yes," he said. "I have thought about all of it, about the license, about what you said about the market, about what you said about being sure. I have thought about the meadow. I have thought about a small boy on a stone wall in Wrenhaven. I have thought about a physician who traveled from London 3 winters ago, and about a pension that arrived at my father's door without any name attached to it." The Duke's eyes flickered. He did not speak. "I do not," she said, "give my heart lightly. I have not given it before. I do not intend to give it again. But it seems to me that a heart which is not given carefully is not much of a gift, and that a heart which is not given at all is not a heart at all, only a thing kept in a box. I would rather it be given than kept." She looked at him. "So my answer, Your Grace, is yes. I will marry you. Not because of gratitude. Not because you are a duke. Because I have watched you carefully for some months now, as you asked me not to, and I have decided that you are, in the ways that matter to me, a good man. And because when you spoke by the stream yesterday, you were the first person in my life who has said, in plain words, that they saw me, and that what they saw was enough." There was a silence. Her father looked down at his hands with the smallest possible smile in the corner of his mouth. The Duke set down his teacup very carefully on its saucer. He rose. He crossed the small parlor. He did not kneel. That was not his way, and it would not have been true. But he took her hand in both of his own and lifted it and held it against his cheek for a moment without speaking. His skin was warm. She could feel, faintly, where he had shaved that morning. She could smell again that clean under scent that she suspected was only him. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, very low. "Vivienne, thank you." That was all. That was enough. The wedding was small. It was held in her father's own church at Little Pemberton 3 weeks later, on a bright October morning that smelled of wood smoke and turning leaves. The Duke's mother came from Bath, dressed in dove gray, and behaved throughout with the perfect courtesy of a woman who had long ago decided her son knew his own mind and was too clever to argue with. She kissed Vivienne once, on the cheek, before the ceremony, and said quietly, "You have a strong hand, my dear. I am glad of it. He has needed one for a long while." That was the only thing she ever said to Vivienne about the matter, and it was, Vivienne thought, more than enough. The boy from the market came too. His mother brought him. He was scrubbed pink, and his blue coat had been let out an inch at the wrist to accommodate the last 2 weeks of growing. He clung to his mother's skirt during the ceremony and stared at Vivienne the whole time with the wide grave eyes of a child who did not entirely understand what was happening, but understood that it was, somehow, about him. When it was over, and Vivienne came down the aisle on the Duke's arm, the boy broke free of his mother and ran up to Vivienne and pressed something into her hand. It was a small piece of ginger cake, wrapped in a scrap of paper, slightly squashed. She knelt down, in her wedding dress, on the flagstones of her father's church, and she took his little face in her hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved me," he whispered back, as if he had been practicing the words. "You saved me too," she said. She meant it. She would not, until much later, know quite how much she meant it. She only knew, in that moment, kneeling in the dust of the aisle with the smell of candle wax and turning leaves and cold stone in the air, that the small, warm shape of a child had, on a bright, loud day of terror, put her in the way of the only life she had ever really wanted, and that a great man with a heavy gaze and a scarred knuckle had walked out of a running herd and seen her. And that these two things together made a kind of small, quiet miracle that she would not spend the rest of her life trying to explain, but only, in her own small, quiet way, trying to be worthy of. And that was, in the end, enough for any life, and more than most were ever given.